Hi. Hello. Welcome to one of our Humanities Centre events revolving around the fellowship programme. That is something we do every year, where we get people from across the college, as well as other colleges on occasion, to talk about a particular theme that we decided upon. This year's theme is Space and Place. Next year, by the way, we'll be doing around the idea of design, which you can find details of online. So if any of you aren't current fellows, because if you're a current fellow, you can't do it twice in a row, the rule against that. If you're interested in being a fellow next year, then have a look at that, particularly if design is something you're interested in. So what we do is we have 5 or 6 faculty fellows and a couple of postgraduate fellows, and we meet every other week. We read readings together, and then as things develop, we start to read each other's work. And it's a really lovely opportunity to develop those interdisciplinary conversations that we often don't get as we're stuck in our particular silos wherever they are doing our disciplinary work. So this is the second of these events for the public. The first was a roundtable discussion of the theme. This is the first of our talks by some of the fellows themselves about the work that they've been doing. So we have 3 talks today. We're going to sort of run consecutively and then have discussion after the talks have all been, so that we can have more of that interdisciplinary discussion around common themes as well as individual questions. So today we have Len Albright, he's an assistant professor in sociology and public policy and human affairs, urban affairs, and Emily Artiano, who's a PhD candidate in English, and Serena Parekh, who's assistant professor in philosophy. We're going to go in that order. So the first is Len Albright. Cool.
Very good. All right, I'm going to figure out how to excellent system. I'm going to do a test thing with the clicker here to see. No? That way down, right? Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Len Albright. I'm assistant professor in sociology and public policy. I'm going to present some work that I've been doing for my book project, which is called Making It Out Here. I presented parts of this in the spring in a faculty works in progress program. It was January. It was the first week of school. So maybe some of you were here, maybe you weren't. If you were, maybe that information is long gone. So I'm hoping that this information is new to a lot of people. So I'm interested in this question of how we can have home and how we can have mobility at the same time. I want to do a thought experiment just for a second. So everyone just kind of like, just close your eyes for a second. All right, my eyes are closed. So I want you to think about, where will you be in a year? Where do you want to be in a year? All right, now think about, where do you want to be in 5 years? Now what about 20 years? Go, 20 years from now, where do you want to be? Where? Hawaii? I went, alive. I thought you said Hawaii. I was like, I am right there with you. That sounds great. Okay. Well, you bring up an interesting point. Part of that is, when we start thinking about things like mobility, where we're going to go, it might be place-based. It might be, I'm thinking about, in my mind, I was like, man, Cape Cod, I want to be fishing for striped bass, and I'm great. Or you might be thinking about life cycle. You might be thinking about career trajectory. You might be thinking about family, and who we are in our positions in life, whether it's age, education, race, class, gender, neighborhood, can influence how we imagine futures for ourselves and the forces that can constrict and enable those futures that we imagine. So I'm going to present some data on my book project, which is a study of people in motion. So I study people that live in low-income housing, subsidized housing in the suburbs. And I studied New Jersey. It's a 140-unit low-income housing complex. And I studied people who were in motion, people who had lived in cities. They lived in places like Philadelphia, Camden, New Jersey, Trenton, Newark, and they had moved to live in subsidized housing in the suburbs for some reason. And I wanted to understand why. Why did you make this move? It's a big move. You're moving to a place where you don't know anyone, might be a lot different from a place where you lived before. What was that about? What was that experience about? So in a past book that I did with a group of researchers at Princeton, we wanted them to know, like, what does this do? Is this good for people? And we found out there was all kinds of positive gains for people that chose to make this move. People were more economically self-sufficient. They had gains in education and health. But I wanted to understand, what's this experience all about? What's the psychological experience? How does this look at the community level? And when I would go and I would interview residents who lived in this low-income housing, a lot of residents would use this term out here. They would talk about Mount Laurel and Ethel Lawrence, the low-income housing complex, as being out here compared to there, which they're meaning where they used to live or where they're going. And it was clear that this kind of dichotomy of out here and there was meaningful for people. And that it was meaningful not just in how people made sense of themselves, but how they interacted with other people. So some of my questions were, how do residents' conceptions of their future structure their social lives? So that same exercise that we did, where do you see yourself going in a year, 5 years, 20 years? What does that mean in terms of who you interact with? The types of resources you seek, the types of experiences you put yourself in the direction of. And how does place specifically influence these conceptions of future and vice versa? I talked to a friend on the phone last night who just lost his job. And I said to him, well, he lives in New York City. And I said, what are you going to do? And I thought he was immediately going to go to, well, I'm going to go back to school, I'm going to get an MBA, or I'm going to try to network. And his response was, I think I'm going to move to Portland. And I was like, Portland? What's in Portland? He's like, I don't know, coffee and nature. And I was like, all right, well, that's one way to solve your occupational problem, is just move clear across the country. He doesn't know anybody there. Well, Portland, I think would be a great place to live. But you can see how things like place and mobility become, linked in these day-to-day decisions of people. So just some context in terms of public policy. There's lots of public policy that happens both domestically and abroad around incentivizing integration, both class and race-based integration. So there was the Gautreaux program in Illinois, which led to a very expensive and kind of poorly thought out federal program called Moving to Opportunity in the United States. And then Climbing Mount Laurel was the book that I worked on in New Jersey. It was another mobility program. But all of these studies are studying people in motion, people who are moving into low-income housing in a different place. And why that's important is because it gives us an opportunity to understand neighborhood effects. How does place matter? Particularly, how does place matter for people that are trying to change, right? They're trying to be more economically self-sufficient. They're trying to have a better life for themselves or their family. So how does place come to matter? So this is the Ethel Lawrence Homes. This is the complex that I've written about in the past and now. 140 units. It's all low-income housing. This is Philadelphia. These are some of the suburban subdivisions. So I spent about 2 years basically hanging out here, basically did everything short of living here, playing basketball with kids, tutoring kids, going to cookouts, interviewing everyone that lived in the complex to try to understand what life was like. This is the Ethel Lawrence Homes at the ground level. Just to give you a sense of the type of move that some people were making, this is New Jersey. This is Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. This is a map of income in the year 2000 when the homes opened. You see the lighter colors are the lowest median household income, in some cases less than $20,000 in the census tract. And the darker areas are up to $100,000 per family. Where this blue star is, that's Mount Laurel. So it's relatively high on the income. We're looking at between $65,000 to $100,000 per family. The majority of families who were moving to Mount Laurel were coming from places like North and West Philadelphia, Camden, and Trenton. So these were families that were living in the context of very low levels of income, often high levels of poverty, and now they're making a move into an area that's very different. People with very different access to resources, life experience. This is percentage poverty of the year 2000. Again, the blue star is Mount Laurel. You see relatively low levels of poverty, almost 0%, compared to places like Camden, where people were moving from. So this was a big move for people. Moving for anyone is kind of a scary and a difficult experience. When you're moving somewhere quite different from where you are currently living, I think it can add to the complexity of the experience of that move. So just briefly, and this is what I talked about in January, we ended up finding all kinds of positives for people that made this move, compared to, say, people that stayed in Camden, that wanted to move to Mount Laurel, but there wasn't enough housing available. So we did this whole comparison study. We found that people that lived in Mount Laurel had a higher likelihood of employment, higher annual income, higher share of their income from work, likelihood of using welfare went significantly down, and people were less anxious. So there are all these effects. So I want to understand, well, how can we account for this? And how can we account for this idea that people have in their head about where they're going, where they came from, where they are now? So my question is, how does place factor into mobility narratives? This is that 1 year, 5 year, 10-year plan thing, right? We can just go to Hawaii, or we can go to Portland, or we can go to Mount Laurel, or we can conceptualize mobility as a ratcheting up in all other kinds of ways. And sometimes that movement is linked. So I'm trying to get at those kind of intersections. And then second, how is place an influencing or symbolic factor in the coordination of futures? So when we're talking about our 1 or our 5 or our 10-year plans, this is our imagination, right? We've imagined some future self for ourselves. And what I think is interesting is that we work to coordinate our futures together. So just like all the junior faculty in my department, we'll get together every couple of months to encourage each other to work towards tenure. We are coordinating our future plans. We're looking 4 or 5 years out. Parents who are trying to get their kids into a good college in middle school will get together to try to make sure that the parents have the resources they have for their kids. This isn't about what the kids need now, it's about plans that they have for the future. So the future is really important for animating our behavior now, how we interact with people, who we engage with, what we do. So I pulled these out in part because this Space and Place Fellowship has been interdisciplinary, and I've really learned a lot from talking to philosophers and people in the English department, historians, medievalists. That's been amazing. It's incredible. So I've been digging back and looking at how sociology has dealt with some of the problems that I think other disciplines have dealt with probably better than we have. So we're talking about people's stories, right? My 10-year plan, my 5-year plan, where am I going? So, well, part of that, this is about accounts, right? People are taking some account of their life. They're saying, this is where my life is now. This is how I've gotten here. This is where I'm going. And there's been a pretty healthy conversation about the sociology of accounts. Now, as we're taking account of where we're at, we're basically taking a balance sheet. Part of what we do is we attribute causation. Now, philosophers are really good at understanding attribution, right? This is like the Gettier problem. It's like, okay, if I believe that, I'm going back to like college here. If I believe something caused X, but Y actually caused X, does that matter? Is that still, it's just like, I'm not a philosopher. That's why I didn't study philosophy. I can't handle logic. But sociology, too, is interested in understanding attribution, but we tend to couch it more in terms of causation, right? We want to understand what are the effects, what's causing X and Y. And then sociologists are also interested in narrative. This is what scholars in English and literature, medieval studies tend to do really well because they're interested in how do we tell stories, how do we craft stories, what is in a story. For sociologists, narrative matters because this is our data. When I'm hanging out with people in FL Lawrence and they're telling me a 20-minute story about where they were and where they're going, this is a narrative. They're often crafting it in this linear story, and this gives me tools to try to pick it apart, understand it, what's informing it. Now, getting into sociology, one of the things I'm interested in is this idea of futures in action, right? So we are living our futures. We're coordinating our futures together, whether it's housing or it's tenure or whatever our project is. So I want to understand, how do we understand these cognitions of a projected future? How does this play out in particular social contexts? And what are the contours and relational dynamics of this projectivity? So the idea that, maybe my neighbor, I don't feel like we're on the same path, so I'm not going to interact with them. But my neighbor on the other side of the street, I feel like we're on the same path, so we're going to hang out. And then maybe we're going to, kind of banter and kind of share gossip about that other neighbor to kind of put them down and make ourselves feel better. Well, this matters, right? This matters about how we're interacting, who we're sharing our resources with. Now, I think this is interesting. This was the headline of a news story about Mount Laurel, and it said, this is FL Lawrence, Mount Laurel affordable housing decision made dreams come true. And that's a nice positivist story, right? But it's like, but what were people's dreams, right? Like, what was this about? Are these dreams are people still making their dreams? Or the fact that they just got there is like, oh, God, my dream is done, now I can just hang out, I've made it. So, the question becomes, why did people want to make this move? Does it fit into some projected concept of their future, what's informing that? And how does time matter? How do people view this time in their lives? How does this come to matter for ordering our meaning, our conflicts over space, how we live day to day? So I just want to give you kind of to jump into my data. So these are some quotes and some stories from people that I talk to that get at some of these kind of interesting intersections. So one of the first things when I would knock on people's doors and I'd say, hey, my name's Len, I'm interested in your experience of living in Ethel Lawrence homes. People would say things like, the first question you're to ask me is, how did I get here? And I'd be like, that was not my first question, but how did you get here? So like, for example, this woman who was a nurse in her 50s, the first thing she said to me was, are you going to get into, gee, how did I end up in here? Because one of the things I think is so interesting in myself is that I'm a registered nurse. I'm a professional. And now no way in my life did I think I would end up in Ethel Lawrence. So her narrative is about kind of being surprised at where her life ended up. You know, she thought, okay, I was a professional, I sought the education, I had the economic resources. I wouldn't think that I would ever be in a place where I would need to live in subsidized housing, and now look at where I am. So she ends up trying to kind of make sense and struggle with this. Now, this was a mom with a few children. She said to me, this was like a dream from me. She lived in high-rise public housing in Queens. Coming from New York, it was like a dream. I lived in a big building with drugs and fights. I've seen it all. I didn't really want my kids to grow up there. So for her, this is about this imagined future of her kids, a life that she is trying to create for her children that is different from hers. I want my children to have a better childhood than what I had. So I was born and raised in Camden all my life, and I saw I was going to get the opportunity to get my kids out of Camden. That's what it's going to be. So this is people conceptualizing mobility in terms of how they understand their experience in their place. And I no way intend this to be disparaging anyway towards Camden. Lots of good people in Camden. It just shows how people are making sense of the types of movement that they're doing. Now, people would say, how did I get here? And then they'd say, answer questions like, where am I? Where I am right now. Depending on who you're talking to, it impacts, and this is a woman I interviewed telling me this, depending on who you're talking to, it impacts the types of response you get back. When you talk to people not from the area and you stay in Mount Laurel, their first assumption is, oh, you have money. But if you're talking with someone who lives in Mount Laurel, who knows Ethel Lawrence, it's, oh, you live in Ethel Lawrence? So, you know, this impacts how people perceive whether or not they fit into their community, whether or not people are judging them, or whether or not they feel like they've made it. So when people in Ethel Lawrence talk to people outside of Mount Laurel, people say, oh, you're from Mount Laurel, like you've made it. But within Mount Laurel, people say, oh, you didn't make it, you're only here because of this subsidized housing, which is bad for people's self-esteem. Now, this is where people start having this kind of relationship of out here and back home and what that means. This is a woman named Ms. Mary, she's in her 70s. She basically is like a surrogate kind of grandmother to a lot of the children who live in the neighborhood. And she said, she was talking about her neighbor who she was a close friend. She said she didn't want anybody to know she lived out here. She was upset about low to moderate income. She would say, I don't want them to know I live here. I go to a friend's house because I won't give them my address. I'm like, why is he so embarrassed? I'm proud to say I live in the Ethel Lawrence homes because they're gorgeous. People don't even know how nice the places are. So she is kind of drawing on her experience in Ethel Lawrence homes to kind of affirm her life trajectory, her self-esteem, how she feels about herself, and as where her friend felt embarrassed about it. Now if we're interested in things like health outcomes on people, we're measuring their health outcomes, if you feel good or bad about where you live, that's going to impact your stress level, all these different things that we measure, things like blood pressure. Now some people ended up in Mount Laurel and they kind of said, where am I? Like, where have I arrived? Some people would say, this is an interview, I'm on a different level than some of the people that moved in. You got some people that came from Camden, so this is like a whole new world from them. This is like glory to them. For me, I was on a different level. She had lived in Mount Laurel previously. So the surroundings was nothing. I was just grateful I'm in a decent place, I don't have a slumlord, and my kids are getting their education. For her, this very much just felt like this kind of lateral move. Now, what about mobility? Where am I going? One mother said, I think it's on the path we're trying to stay on. We do eventually want to own, so we don't want to get too comfortable, but we also want to make sure our children are able to take full advantage of the school system. Now, this is about things like health. I asked the woman, how do you feel out here? And she said, you think clearer. This is a place I want to stay until I find a home that's mine. Do you know what I mean? Moving here makes me feel not stuck. Makes me know I can do better. And to me, this is a place that's good now, but it makes me want to do more. So she feels good at home, but she's already starting to look away. She's already starting to look other places. Now that's going to matter for who she's interacting with, networks that she forms. Now what about this idea of moving in place? The idea that we can be in the same place, but we can have mobility. One interviewee said, I literally have had friends say, why don't you try to buy a house? And I tell them all the time, I'd much rather live in an area and rent where my children are going to go to the top schools in the state than own in an area where we can afford to buy, where we would have to lower our standards for education. So this is her saying, I'm giving peer pressure for people to say, in order for you to be, for me to conceive of you as mobile, you should be a homeowner, right? Because we attribute status to homeownership in our society. And she's responding and saying, no, for me, mobility is actually staying put, right? Because my mobility story right now is all about my kids' education. And if I move away, I'm going to lose that opportunity. So this is where we get into things like the government's incentivizing home ownership programs. Does that always make sense? Where we want to start thinking about education policy as opposed to housing policy. Now, some people talk about feeling stuck. This could be kind of a place that is, kind of metaphorically stuck in you, or you literally feel physically stuck. Once, one person assessing her neighbor who she had some issues with, she said they came from Camden and everything was going well, but the kids started acting up. They couldn't adjust. They had what was in them from the ghettos. I guess it just never left them. They couldn't see the paradise. Now this impacted, her friendship with this woman. She didn't let her kids play with these kids. Now, this is impacting networks here. Another woman said, "You see how I keep my door chained? I'm afraid by myself. Yes, sometimes I'm afraid because I'm going back to the old days in Camden. I learned how to watch your surroundings." So this is a woman who had moved from an area with high poverty, high crime to Mount Laurel, low poverty, low crime, where part of the point is that her body could relax. She wouldn't have to be so tense and scared. But what you're seeing is that fear is continuing, right? So this could give us some information about how to start to understand health impacts of these moves. Making it back home. Some people said, this is fine, but I'm trying to get back somewhere. So one woman had moved from a nearby town called Willingboro, and I said, if you could get back there, would you? And she said, yeah, I'd go back to Willingboro. That's only because I know we stick together. I know if I'm not home and I ask my neighbor to wash my house, she'll be able to wash my house, and I don't have to worry about anything. If she sees something suspicious, she'll call the township instead of calling the office, where the office here is just going to come at me. I ain't going to lie, I feel more safe in Willingboro than I do here. This is just a kind of a break from the quotes. This is one of the kids playing violin in our house. Done? Okay, all right, I'll wrap it up. So people are coordinating these futures, and they're doing it through coordinating space. So residents organize, identify, and control space to align with their coordinated futures. I gave that example of people saying things like, I don't see myself in the same path as that person, so I'm not going to interact with them. And then houses look at the ground level. In Ethel Lawrence Homes, there's a neighborhood watch, which actively works with property management. And here, the watch relays information about tenant behavior. Now, you'd think that a neighborhood watch is a good idea, right? It's a monitoring. It's kind of it's not the state that's monitoring kind of and sanctioning behavior. But what this can do is this can lead to some erosion in trust and fear of use of public space by some residents, because residents feel like they're being monitored and surveilled by their neighbors. So some residents said, I moved out here so I didn't have to be surveilled. I live in a neighborhood where there's constant surveillance. I want to live here. I want to be able to get out of that. But there were other residents that said, look, the path that I'm on, this is about organizing and controlling space in a certain way. Residents said, out here I feel like I'm in a halfway house, like I'm trying to get rehabilitated for society. That's how I feel here because you don't have enough privacy. So you can see how this starts to matter and the consequences in space. So just wrapping up, where I'm going to go, consequences for theory. This idea of conceptualizing future work and its coordination as one factor in neighborhood effects, how neighborhoods come to impact all those outcomes that we're interested in, health, education, economics. How to imagine futures lead to particular configurations of control in things like space. And what is our impact on things like network formation and the nature of ties? And finally, this question of understanding the role of place and mobility. So I'm at this point where I'm kind of like juggling all this as I'm trying to finish the book. So that's why it's a bit of a kind of work in progress. But thanks for your attention and look forward to feedback.
Thanks a lot, Len. I should have introduced myself at the beginning, I forgot. So I'm Tim Cresswell, I'm the Associate Director of the Humanities Centre. Laurie she's a back now. He's a Director of the Humanities Centre. We've been enjoying running these things. One of the most amazing things about these discussions is the variety of backgrounds people come from, and how a theme like space and place can bring people together who would maybe not have a conversation normally. And I think you'll get that sense from these three presentations that seem to have this common theme going through, not just the space and place, but of the relationship between mobility and place in particular ways. And you'll see that contrast in at least empirical terms. Next is one of our postgraduate fellows, Emily Artiano from English, is going to talk to us. And it's a great pleasure to have the postgrads involved in particular in these discussions, because as we all know, they're the people on the cutting edge of developing ideas, so it refreshes all of us.
Not in anything digital. Thank you to the Humanities Center, to the chairs, Tim Cresswell, Lori Lefkowitz, Megan, and the other fellows for the opportunity to explore this theme with scholars from other disciplines. It's been fantastic. And thank you to the English department, to Team Poiger and the College of Social Sciences and Humanities for all the support as I finished my dissertation this year. So, presentation is called Removed from Home, Language Acts in Space of Colonial New England. As I briefly explained at last month's roundtable, my project is largely concerned with the phenomenon of linguistic colonization, or colonization by way of language, as for instance, when colonized diasporic Africans and Native Americans were forced to abandon their mother tongues in favor of English. And this quote behind me is a pretty clear example of what this might look like in the 17th century. Through literary text, my project makes visible the nuances of and challenges the long-standing narrative that purports a unidirectional story of conquering space and cohering place through language. My project spans the colonial and early national periods in America and considers both canonical and lesser-known texts as case studies to explore the multidirectional influences of language in early America. My dissertation analyzes language acts in literary texts as situated, dynamic exchanges that constituted colonial and then national space. And through the readings and discussions in the Humanities Center so far this year, I've really been trying to think about how space and place, think about place and space in a more analytical and theoretical way to uncover both what theories of space and place might offer to my project and what my project can offer to discussions surrounding space and place. My presentation today is my attempt to share with you some of that work through a concrete example in one of the chapters of my dissertation. The first chapter of my dissertation traces the history of Puritan missionary efforts toward Native Americans in New England in the 17th century. Efforts that largely hierarchize the English language over Algonquin, which is the language family that encompassed a lot of the specific tribal languages in New England. I want to consider the way these efforts coincided both with colonial claims to space and colonial affirmation of placial belonging as English. Through a reading of the 1682 canonical captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson, which I'm going to turn to momentarily, I want to show another version of the story of space, place, and language, one that highlights linguistic negotiations in early America that constitute colonial space. So these are three different editions of the narrative that are covered. The linguistic negotiations in narratives, poems, hymns, novels, and other texts illuminate language as action, one of the hallmarks of translingualism, a term that describes how language is reshaped in time and space. In other words, language as an act accounts for the fluid and unstable qualities of language that necessitate a constant negotiation of meaning. A translingual approach, which is often used in contemporary writing studies, but which I apply to early American literature in my work, privileges speakers' and writers' negotiations of language over the structures of language, and suggests that we must view language as both a product of and as constantly producing spatial and social interactions. Rather than understanding language as a reflection of a particular time and place, Alistair Pennycook argues that we must view language, quote, as action and as part of how places are interpreted, how the meaning of places is reinforced or changed. Thus, language is largely an integrated social and spatial activity. Claims to space in colonial New England led to conflict and war, but also to linguistic negotiations and curious forms of languaging, or the doing of language, that in many ways produced and reproduced the spaces inhabitants claimed. On February 10, 1676, Nipmuc Narragansett and Wampanoag Indians entered and attacked the home of a 39-year-old Puritan woman named Mary Rowlandson in Lancaster, Massachusetts. Of 37 persons who were in this one house, Rowlandson reports, none escaped either present death or a bitter captivity, save only one. The Indians took 24 of the British colonials in Lancaster, including Rowlandson and her children, captive, a wartime practice. King Philip's War, which lasted from 1675 to 76, was fought between Puritan colonists and Algonquin alliance under King Philip, Sachem of the Wampanoag tribe, over the colonial settlement in native land. After her release, Rowlandson wrote The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, published in Boston in 1682, a narrative recounting her 11 weeks in captivity and her eventual return home after she was ransomed for 20 pounds. The narrative achieved enduring popularity with 4 editions published in 1682 and 30 editions to date. It was a huge bestseller in its time. Contemporary audiences were fascinated by the experience of captivity and the events of war, and the narrative allowed them to follow Rowlandson through her removes without having to actually experience her trials, tragedies, and traumas. Scholars today are interested in the formal way that she narrates this space 6 years after she returns to Lancaster, and the way in which Rowlandson preserves her subjectivity and culture through narrative. Looking specifically to narrative and language, I explore how linguistic negotiations disrupt such preservation and constitute the textual space of the narrative and colonial space for the readers. Rowlandson begins her narrative explaining, quote, that I may better declare what happened to me during that grievous captivity, I shall particularly speak of the several removes we had up and down the wilderness, end quote. The several removes take Rowlandson north through Massachusetts to Beckwell River and then back to central Massachusetts. And this is a slide of her removes, and as you can see, she calls them removes. She's being removed further and further from home, but in fact, she's actually kind of doing a loop, and she's coming back home. So it's really more depicting the space she traversed with her captors rather than how far away she is from that place. In the second remove, she writes, I must turn my back upon the town and travel with them into the vast and desolate wilderness. And so begins Rowlandson's journey through space and time, told through movements and pauses, interactions, and reflections. Situating Rowlandson's narrative in a larger conversation about space, place, and time helps, or it's been helping me to understand this text as a narration that produces colonial space in a particular way for its readers. Arguing that exclusion of natives was essential to national identity in North America, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri write, Native Americans had to be excluded from the terrain to open its spaces and make expansion possible. If they'd been recognized, there would have been no real frontier on the continent and no spaces to fill. The understanding of space in relation to Native people and the deep territorialization that Hart and Negri recount and critique describes a unidirectional history of European colonization, one that figures space as empty, fixed, or blank, one that nationalism often perpetuates. In contrast, Doreen Massey's theoretical account considering space as open, multiple, and relational offers an alternative, one that captures the complex struggles and opportunities of Rowlandson's removes. Massey writes, we read so often of the conquest of space, but what is at issue is also the meeting up with others who are also journeying, also making histories. Conquest, exploration, voyages of discovery are about the meeting up of histories, not merely a pushing out across space. For Massey, space and time are interlinked, and place is a specific articulation of space. Rowlandson, a colonial implicated in the European project of conquest, exploration, and the colonization of space, writes a narrative that in fact demonstrates the negotiations that accompany the meeting up of histories. In recounting these removes, Rowlandson conveys her evolving unease with strict binaries between Puritans and Indians as she moves from the place that she considers home. I think one of the most prominent ways in which Rowlandson expresses her unease and subsequent negotiation is through her depiction and use of languages in relation to the bodies from which languages are spoken or written. In this text, Rowlandson degrades Native American languages, describing them as hellish, indecipherable, and noise. She separates herself from her captors in her descriptions of language, using a dichotomy of English, representative of a coherent and civil place, and Algonquian languages, representative of an incoherent space to be occupied. Such associations are in many ways reflective of the ideology behind linguistic colonization, an ideology that hierarchizes language in a way that justifies the domination of one language over another. However, Rowlandson's language acts, or her languaging, undermine the way she describes language, and specifically the way she describes differences between English and Algonquin. Throughout the remove, Rollinson understands native language, she begins to enjoy native meals, she participates in a native economy to ensure her survival, and she even slips into using the plural first-person pronoun we to refer to herself and her captors in her narration. So these are several of the points in the narrative in which she says we. At almost every other point in the narrative, she tries to develop a very distinct separation, and this slide kind of just draws it out a little bit more, a distinct separation between herself and her captors with I and them and they and me, and these are some instances where that kind of slips. Even in writing her story years after her release, she still struggles to completely separate herself from her captors, to maintain her placial belonging as a British subject, and to ensure the reader that she is not, quote, gone native, which was a common fear for captives of Native Americans in the colonial period. Rollinson claims English as a symbol of a familiar place separate from the space she travels with her captors. She uses Algonquin words in linguistic forms in her captivity narrative to express a separation between herself and her captors. In using this language as a marker of difference, though, she embodies and performs Algonquin, effectively code meshing, and I have a couple different definitions of code meshing behind me, thus implicating herself in a cultural exchange that muddies the absolute distinction between Puritan and Native. Although a white Puritan woman wrote the sovereignty and goodness of God, Native American bodies, speech acts, and languages are embedded in this text and reflect a process of counter-colonization. Rollinson's narrative reproduces Native languages and communicative forms, and in so doing expresses Native American language's integrality to her own writing. Because the author is a white Puritan, Rollinson's reproduction of Native American language structures and words through co-meshing unsettle an essentialized dichotomy in which Rollinson would embody a civilized English language and her native captors would embody an inferior savage language. While Rollinson makes linguistic choices, she participates in languaging, and Pennycook points out, as we do language, we remake the language and the space in which this happens. Rollinson makes the space of the narrative and remakes the space she occupies during the captivity that she recounts. And I just want to briefly move through a few examples specifically showing how she uses specific Native American or Algonquin words in her text. So. Rollinson uses the words papoose, Sanak, squaw, and wigwam, all deriving from Algonquin languages throughout her narrative. She writes papoose, which is translated in Narragansett language to mean child. She uses that word 11 times. In the 13th remove of the narrative, Rollinson explains that one asked her to make a shirt for her papoose. And just after the burial of a papoose, Rollinson recalls, on a sudden my mistress gives out, and she called her Sanak, a word that originates from the Algonquin language to mean a married man. Additionally, Rollinson uses the term squaw, a word of Narragansett and Massachusetts origin, which Roger Williams, which is behind me, a page of his text, he translates to mean woman in the Narragansett language. It's also a word used by many other tribes to refer to the wife of an old Indian. Rollinson uses squaw 29 times and never woman to refer to Native American adult women in her text. Why does she choose to integrate Algonquin words in her text, and why in these instances? An analysis of when and why Algonquin words appear in the text might tell us something about not only Rollinson's values or the values of her captors, but also about the imagined incompatibility of their values and how this incompatibility disrupts a coherent notion of places separated by culture. I suggest that Rollinson's rhetorical and linguistic choices serve two purposes. First, Rollinson racializes, and also genders in the case of Sanup and Squaw, the individuals to whom she refers. The words papoose, Sanup, and Squaw might translate into English, but for Rollinson, the English translation does not have the racial connotation she needs to express difference to her audience. Second, in the instances I'm citing, and in many others, Rollinson uses Algonquin words to express kinship relations. For Rollinson, a wife, a husband, or a couple's child, if Native American, must be marked as such through language. Similarly, Rollinson refers to the space where her captors lodge as a wigwam, a variant of the Algonquin word for house, wigwam, but refers to the wigwam which she eats, sleeps, and reads as home. Rollinson refers to her house and home in Lancaster often and laments that in opposition to her current status, she once, quote, had husband and father and children and sisters and friends and relations and house and home and many comforts of this life. This formulation of home is one that, according to Iris Marion Young, expresses expresses a yearning for a whole and stable identity and an illusion of coherence and safety that the idea of home often represents. Certainly, Rowlandson's nostalgia for her familiar home is based on a conception of a coherent and homogeneous Puritan community. But as I mentioned, she also refers to her place of lodging and her domestic space as home. You can see there's a couple examples there. I'm not going to read, but feel free. She writes that she accepted a piece of bear, but in her pocket, put it in her pocket and, quote, came home. And Rowlandson refers to the structures in which Native Americans lodge, and explicitly separates these structures from what she considers to be a home. She writes, if I went to another wigwam, they would be angry and send me home again. Rowlandson can refer to the wigwam as a home only when referring to the wigwam where she lives, where she sleeps. The space of the home, which functioned to describe both private domestic space and the space of the imperial center in colonial America, cannot describe a Native American's abode. Thus, the Algonquin word wigwam allows Rowlandson to maintain the cultural signification of the English word and notion of home. A home is where a white Puritan woman lives, even if it is the structure of a wigwam, and a wigwam is where a Native American lodges. However, in designating a wigwam in which she sleeps, eats, and reads home, Rowlandson is creating a new sense of place in her specific articulation of space. Iris Marion Young explains that just as home is the materialization of identity, it is also an extension of the person's body, the space that he or she takes up. For Rowlandson, her wigwam becomes her home, and this is how she's able to connect her past to her present. She takes her familiar notion of home, a place that connotes safety, coherence, and a stable identity, and she maps it onto space that becomes an extension of her body while in captivity. In her feminist critique of the themes of house and home, Young advocates for a home that is an expression of bodily routines. So if we can understand Rowlandson's language as an act, as a performance, as a bodily routine, or as a practice when she writes, then her language and her linguistic choice in relation to home, in fact, construct the meaning of the space that she inhabits for her readers. In short, Rowlandson does not often translate when writing about Native American persons, kinship ties, or domestic space in these instances. Throughout her narrative, Rowlandson describes the violence and power of female Native Americans, specifically her mistress, and the polygamy she witnesses. Such gender and marital relations are untranslatable into English and into an English way of life for Rowlandson. Rowlandson's text uses Algonquin words in a rhetorically strategic way to establish the mutual alterity between her own community and the community of her captors, but in so doing, she makes the mutual opacity and permeability of language visible to the reader. Rowlandson recognizes the domestic space of Native Americans even when she presents it as a form of domesticity separate from her own. Rather than indecipherable noise in these instances, Native American language is integral to Rowlandson's text to establish a distinct Native American kinship network represented linguistically. Rowlandson credits Algonquin with its own value. On the one hand, she authenticates her experience of spending time as a captive within this culture, and on the other hand, she implicates herself in another cultural paradigm, a cultural paradigm outside of and in conflict with Puritanism. If, as Edward Casey suggests, culture is both embodied and located, then the merging of these cultural paradigms through language and notions of home specifically suggests that the located bodies of Rowlandson's narrative belong to and constitute the space that they inhabit both physically and textually. Just as Rowlandson ended up back at home after her many moves through space, so we too end up back where we started at the beginning of this presentation, but with a difference. Returning to linguistic colonization in literature, we can see how colonial encounters like those described in Rowlandson's narrative produce a mutual need for one another's language and language acts, not solely for communicative purposes, but also for the purpose of understanding and expressing one's own culture and identity in a constantly changing space. Just as one's identity and culture is never static nor space or place, and all of them need to be constantly negotiated and reconstituted. Furthermore, languaging that expresses identity and culture contributes to the production of space and place. These linguistic exchanges, and specifically the language act of co-meshing, play a prominent role in constituting colonial space and place, not as physical land, but as the meeting up of histories. And in this last minute, I just want to gesture toward my larger project and say that I transitioned from the colonial period to the early national period in New England, and suggest that this is a shift just as much in time as it is in space. And moving forward in my project, I'm mapping linguistic colonization onto the Revolutionary period, and I want to consider the differences and continuities between the colonial and early national period in that way. And I language came to both represent space and also served as a claim to palatial national belonging. And the shift to nationalism and the investment in a national language in the latter half of the 18th century was often purported through primers and hornbooks specifically, and was equated to white Anglo-American identity. Thus, American pedagogy in print presented the United States as an ideally homogenized monolingual nation comprised of Anglo-American citizens. At the United States Revolutionary moment, a strong movement toward monolingualism led by Noah Webster, Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Rush sought to, quote, transcend the United States colonial past and solidify an independent future through a reinvented English language that was a unique and uniform new mode of language for a new culture, which sort of ended up being slight spelling differences. But some saw uniform language as a way of racially purifying the new nation and their citizens, as in his formulation, saw a way of racially purifying the new nation and their citizens, and language and race often became proxies for one another. This formulation included non-Anglo subjects who had not mastered the English language from the print public sphere. So what I consider are non-native English speakers who were able to master and perform aesthetic control of the English language, such as Samson Occam and Phyllis Wheatley, the first Native American man and the first African American woman, to publish writings in English respectively. They both bolster their tenuous claim to authority through the use of the English language. And then I look at their way that they use translation, non-English terms, and how they negotiated this exclusionary national consciousness. The meeting up of histories, the histories, for instance, of a formerly enslaved poet, a well-traveled Native American missionary, and a white founding father, come to produce the space of the print public sphere and national space itself in the latter half of the 18th century. So in re-examining all these texts together as making colonial and national space in the meeting up of histories through language, I think that we can begin to speak back to a domination and erasure enacted by English-only colonial and early national histories. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. As you can see, there is a diverse array of stories we have to tell, even if some of the analytical concepts that are being used are the same. And that will continue when we move on to talk about refugees, one of the groups of people in the world where ideas of home and away and mobility and place are some of the strongest resonances. And Serena Parekh from Open Philosophy is going to talk about that.
Hi everyone, it's so great to see such a great turnout in exam week. Thank you so much for being here. As Tim mentioned, my name is Serena Parekh. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy, and great to see some students here as well. I'm going to be talking about basically a philosophical critique of a kind of contemporary space, namely the refugee camp. And I'm writing a book on this topic, so I thought by way of presenting my argument, I would give you an overview of the philosophical moral argument that I'm making in my book. So, before, as it's called, Between Human and Citizen, Refugees, Stateless People, and Other Moral Problems. Before I do, I just want to talk about a contemporary event. Some of you might have heard of this ship. It's called the Mare Nostrum. It's part of the Italian Navy, and it has, for the last 10 or so years, been a rescue ship rescuing migrants off the Mediterranean Sea coming from North Africa to Europe. Last year, human rights groups estimate about 4,000 people died in that crossing. The Mare Nostrum rescued 150,000 people. So without this ship, potentially 150,000 people would have died. Now, the Italian legislature just voted to stop funding the ship, so it will no longer be carrying out its mission at the end of this year. And this is, of course, a big event and terrible in all kinds of ways. The reason that's given is because it's created a pull factor, so that the idea is that migrants who might not otherwise want to come to Europe will be lured at the thought that they might be rescued when they're drowning, and that's why they will cross over. But for whatever reason, it tells us something about our view of the global poor in general, but in particular, people who want to come into our country, migrants in general. I'm not specifically talking about the group that's represented in this picture, namely economic migrants, people who are desperate for a start start to life because of economic circumstances. I'm interested in the 72 million people that lack a cohesive term. In general, they can be understood as involuntary migrants or forced migrants. These are people who are forced to flee their home and have no state who will adjudicate their claims, no state to which they can appeal for their human rights. So in this group, you will have refugees, the group that we would consider refugees. You'd have internally displaced people, you would have asylum seekers. You'd have people of concern to the UN Refugee Agency that we wouldn't consider refugees, but are de facto refugees. They are in exactly the same circumstances as refugees, but they don't fulfill the convention definition of a refugee. Another important fact is that the majority of people in this situation are protracted. Namely, what this means is that the average length of time that people are in this situation is 15 years, so a little bit short of a generation. And so that's on the one hand. So you have 72 million people. This is roughly 1 in every 100 human beings on Earth, roughly the size of the population of the UK. On the other hand, you have sovereign states, which rightly or wrongly agree that they have the right to determine membership. And they have the right to say, you can't come into our border. You can't come into our country. So the result is that this large group of people lives more or less permanently outside of any given territorial nation state. And no state acknowledges responsibility to this group. So the question that I want to raise in my book is, what, if anything, do we owe to people living in this situation? It starts with a discussion of what philosophers have done in the past, as I guess any disciplinary book would do. So philosophers have a larger debate over what's called the ethics of immigration, right? How do we treat everybody equally and yet at the same time have an immigration policy that says some people can come in and other people can't? So this is a big discussion in philosophy. Almost everybody agrees that refugees make a distinct claim on us as members of the democratic state. Because the claim that refugees make is that the only way we can help them is by letting them in. If you do not let us in, we will perish, we will be tortured, we will be persecuted. So they make a distinct claim, a claim that's distinct from other kinds of immigrants. This has led to what I call a debate in the ethics of admission. So the debate is something like this. We are, a wealthy Western democratic state, lots of people would come here. Do we have an obligation to admit refugees, people who have nowhere else to go, who have no home, who have no country, who have no state? This has been the dominant philosophical question for in recent history, since the 1970s, when philosophers have started talking about this. And there's a range of positions. So Michael Walzer says, yes, we have no obligation to let in all refugees, maybe a few, but we can limit them due to this concept of communities of character. You have other more liberal philosophers like Sheila Benedict, Joseph Cairns, Peter Singer, who says, yes, we have much more robust obligations, but also limited. And then you have most recently Christopher Wellman, who says that states can close their borders to all potential immigrants, even refugees, desperately seeking asylum from incompetent or corrupt regimes. The important point for me is that the sole focus of theoretical inquiry is on this question of admission. Who are we obliged to admit? How many? Is it 10% of the number of refugees, 15%, 20%? If so, how do you make a moral claim to the number of refugees? I think this approach is too limited, and it's too limited for a number of reasons. First of all, it's too narrow. So I mentioned that I'm working with this larger group of involuntary migrants, of which refugees can be included as part of. The only people we will accept as refugees are people who fit the UN Refugee Convention definition of a refugee, namely an individual who has crossed a border, is unwilling or unable to avail itself of its state for reasons of political, national, racial, social group, or political group. One of those 5 reasons is why you have to be leaving. If you're leaving because of environmental catastrophe, if you're leaving because of war, if you're leaving because of persecution of any other grounds, we don't consider you a refugee. So the result is that of this group, less than 20% are considered refugees. So of this large group, we would only consider resettling 20%. And of that, less than 1% are ever resettled. So even if we decide we're going to be doubly generous in the future, even if every Western country decides this, it's still a drop in the bucket and doesn't get to the heart of what I consider to be the real problem. What ends up happening is that because we focus so much on resettlement, the majority of people who are in fact refugees, who are de facto stateless, as it's sometimes said, are invisible. They're not part of our normative conversation over what we owe to them. We never ask what happens to people who we justifiably exclude. So we just said we have an obligation to admit some refugees, but not too many. That's the end of the story. Well, what happens to the rest of these people who are justifiably excluded, assuming that you buy these arguments? That question is never asked, and that's what I want to engage in my book. And then finally, I don't think philosophers take seriously the unique harm that comes from being stateless or comes from being a refugee. And I try to articulate this in my book. So, in my book, I argue that there are relevant facts about the refugee regime that philosophers aren't taking seriously. So my fellows will read this in more detail in a few weeks in the chapter that they're going to be discussing. Basically, I look at the interdisciplinary critical refugee regime to try to understand, try to make sense of how this experience is articulated by refugees and by scholars in other disciplines. And what I find is that it's very, very different from the way philosophers talk about it, and not in a good way. So I think they miss out on some relevant empirical facts that affect the moral, our moral understanding of obligations. And two in particular stand out for me. So one is that containment, so large-scale containment in refugee camps, has become the de facto fourth solution for treating refugees. And second, that the solution constitutes a unique and avoidable harm to the displaced. So let me just explain these two really quickly. There are three durable solutions that the UNHCR considers in its rhetoric. Repatriation, going back to your country of origin, voluntary repatriation, resettlement in a third country, there are 13 countries that resettle refugees, or resettlement in the country of first asylum, so countries which host refugees will eventually make you a member. None of these three currently work. In the Cold War, we were all about resettlement. Come to our country, we can embarrass your country. The Cold War ends, mass displacement changes politically, geographically, ethnically. And now all of a sudden, the preferred solution is repatriation back to your home country. Again, these just don't work as large-scale solutions. So the result is that we have encampment. We have large numbers of people, in the millions, living in spaces of containment and confinement for prolonged periods of time. This is what I think is the crucial moral issue around refugees, that this is considered acceptable and appropriate. And philosophers, for all of our moral questioning, have never raised this as a moral question. And I think it's in part because it's misunderstood as a kind of harm. Most people think, yeah, refugee camps are not great, but they're necessary, they're temporary, and they're exceptional. And none of those things happen to be true. They're not temporary. And the average lifespan is 20 years, and very often much, much longer. They start out temporarily, and in the initial period after conflict, within the first 2 years, they're great. After that, they become permanent structures. And almost without exception, this has happened in since the second half of the 20th century. But nor are they efficient. They're not good ways of distributing aid. And in fact, they're the opposite. They give rise to epidemics. They give rise to all kinds of environmental degradation and other kinds of harms that we would want to avoid. And in terms of donors, you would get much more out of your money if it was invested in a country rather than a separate space that was supposed to take care of refugees. So that is one way that refugee camps are misunderstood. A second way that they're misunderstood is that they are harmful. We think refugee camps protect people who underwent terrible harms in the past, but that's a very limited notion. The human rights literature in refugee camps will just knock your socks off. We don't even need to mention that the rights that are enumerated in the Refugee Convention are not protected. Freedom of movement, right to work. They are not protected in any way, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. There's no state that they can appeal to. The UN Refugee Agency is merely an international body with no real political authority. On the other hand, they do terrible, terrible things. Let me give you one example. Sexual and violence in refugee camps. Women in refugee camps, there's virtually 100% rate of sexual assault. There's no other circumstance in which we could justify this as, well, regrettable but inevitable, and it's temporary, so that's okay. And in the most atrocious ways that one could not even imagine. So there's sexual violence, there's prostitution, and sexual violence not from other refugees, from people in the area, as well as NGO workers, humanitarian workers. So these are specific kinds of violent harms that occur in refugee camps. And the scholarly literature seems to conclude that it's inevitable. You can't put people in this kind of extreme circumstance and expect that violence is not going to happen. Refugee camps are by their nature violent places, so the only thing to do is to not have them. And then finally, what I develop in another chapter is that, and then some of you have heard me talk about this before, that refugee camps give rise to an ontological harm. So this is that, in a nutshell, it hurts what it means to be a human being. It destroys our humanity in a particular way, over and above merely physical harm, or merely the harm of the loss of citizenship. So this is, I draw from the critical refugee literature that's interdisciplinary and scholarly, and that I think philosophers, when are theorizing about our obligations to refugees, ignore. And once you do take this in, you can really see why the ethics of admission approach is inadequate. Right? So it doesn't deal with the most salient problems that refugees experience, which is encampment. Of course, they would love to be resettled, but people have stopped dreaming about that a long time ago because they know the overwhelming odds are that that's not going to happen. And for the global community, it's the inequality in burden sharing, which I won't talk about a bit too much, but well over 80% of refugees are housed in developing countries, the countries least able to help them, to deal with them. And most importantly, I think, our focus on resettlement renders invisible the role that we play as members of Western states in creating an unjust global refugee regime. My students this semester, we talked a lot about the ways in which Western states play a role in an unjust global economic order, but we also play a similar role in the refugee regime. So this is a regime which says, you keep them in developing countries, we will give you money, and in return we won't ask any questions. But as long as you keep them away from us, you prevent them from coming to our shores. This is what we do as a matter of policy and as a matter of funding. So we play a role in the harm that refugees experience as refugees. And the ethics of admission ironically helps to justify encampment. Think about it this way. If the goal is resettlement, if the goal is we just are figuring out who's going to come to our country and when, then refugee camps are waiting rooms. They're not nice necessarily, but they're waiting rooms. You can understand why they're not so great. Nobody of you would be crazy enough to invest resources in these waiting rooms. But as I've tried to explain, this is clearly not the case. So, because they're not waiting rooms, they're places where people will spend their lives, and often more than that, often generations, and they'll raise families, and so on and so forth. So this is what I think is wrong with the ethics of admission approach, because it doesn't take seriously these facts. And I think once you do, you'll see that we have actually vastly different moral obligations than philosophers have previously considered. In particular, and this I guess has the most bearing on our talk today, refugee camps ought to not be seen as a morally acceptable solution, in which they are now. In the longer version, I articulate that it's long-term refugee camps, not the immediate, but the long-term refugee camps that endure for more than is absolutely necessary. And as a result, I think what we ought to be saying to our government is not merely we should be taking in more refugees, which I agree with, of course, but it's that we ought not to support this practice, both directly and indirectly. So we support it directly, this is our explicit policy when it comes to dealing with refugees, and we support it indirectly by focusing so much on resettlement and repatriation. Right? Because again, it takes away focus from one of the largest harms that refugees experience, which is encampment. And at the very least, I think, refugee camps function as a new form of political space outside of traditional political spaces, and ought to be subject to the same rigorous moral and political norms that political space as such is. Just to go back to the example of violence against women, there's no circumstance that we in the West would say, we are okay with funding this particular kind of political space, knowing full well that 100% of women are going to be brutally sexually assaulted here. But we give refugee camps a pass. They are exceptional and they are temporary and we can't do anything about it, and I think that is totally untrue. So our obligation ought to be to try to discourage our nation state on this level of policy. Second, I think our perhaps even largest obligation is to work towards the creation of a just refugee regime with a fair system of burden sharing. So I think on the one hand we have a lot that we can do as a nation, but I think our obligation is to work with other nations to develop just refugee policies, because it will never be sufficient for us to take in all, I mean, that would never work, that's not plausible, but we need to do things differently, and I think that can be done. And this argument is obviously asks a lot of us, but it's grounded in two really common sense principles. The first is that we are responsible not only for the intended effects of our policies, but all of the consequences of our policies. And if we as a nation decide, well, we are not allowing refugees in, and every other nation decides that as well, based on the moral legitimacy of sovereignty, the result is encampment. Right? People are displaced, people will continue to be displaced, and if this is our decision, the consequence is going to be long-term permanent encampment. That's the kind of human rights violation that I talk about. The second ground for this principle is that we believe in sovereignty, and I believe in sovereignty. It's a morally legitimate principle, but it cannot, the principle that says that we have complete control over which refugees enter our country cannot be universalized. And this is why. Refugees are embodied beings, which means that they have to occupy physical space on planet Earth. And every inch of planet Earth is under the jurisdiction of a nation state. So they have to go somewhere. So by definition, there has to be some state that is not able to exercise its sovereignty and refuse refugees. And as a matter of fact, it happens to be the poorest and most vulnerable and most open to political incentives to do that. So if we want to have sovereignty, if we want to have a moral basis to our sovereignty, which I think we do, we have to work towards a more equitable system of refugee sharing, of burden sharing as it's called, which is sort of complicated and maybe impossible topic. But nonetheless, this is the goal that we ought to be working towards, rather than merely just talking about how many refugees that we should let in. I'm going to skip through this. The middle chapter is on the ontological deprivation. This is what I said before is a unique harm that refugees experience that I don't think political philosophers take seriously enough. Chapter 4 is on responsibility. For my students from my class, I argue that we have a remedial responsibility based on a particular kind of connection that we have to refugees. But again, I won't go into that here. So let me just conclude my book by saying I am not intending to put forth a book that solves the problem of displacement in the 21st century. But I do think that forced displacement is not going anywhere. And if anything, as my students have taught me this semester, environmental degradation is going to mean environmental refugees on an almost unprecedented scale. So this is going to remain a problem. It's also very unlikely that resettlement or repatriation is going to be sufficient to adequately deal with the problem of mass displacement in the 21st century. So we need to figure out a way to treat the displaced with dignity and assure their human rights under these imperfect circumstances. There are a number of different proposals that are out there in the world that I don't think are given enough serious treatment. So to conclude, and again, I'm a philosopher, so I'm talking to other philosophers, I think philosophers can do more than just discuss resettlement. We can challenge the current practices of containment and control exercised over millions of displaced people that's neither inevitable nor politically or economically necessary. So I think if we reframe the debate of how refugees are understood, the kind of place that they end up in ought to be subject to much more rigorous moral political scrutiny, and I think we will end up having to say that we have to reject this as a viable solution to superfluous human beings. Thank you.
So thank you. As you can see, like I promised, a wide range of empirical circumstances in which issues of place-based mobility have purchased. So I want to open it up to questions. These can be questions to individuals or general questions that you think might spark some interdisciplinary conversations that we're all about. So, questions?
I have a question for I'm sorry, I forget your name, the first speaker.
Len.
Okay, sorry. I guess there's sort of I sort of have an identity both in architecture and urban planning. And I guess there's sort of a fair amount of debate nowadays among urban scholars of planning and poverty and so forth, about the role of place in terms of, some of these, some studies sort of have shown, perhaps convincingly, that sort of being in a sort of a neighborhood of concentrated poverty, as opposed to being more integrated, makes a big difference in the outcomes of families, and especially their children, in terms of their chance of sort of escaping poverty. Then others have kind of criticized that way of thinking and said I think their implication, the criticism is that sort of a conservative way of thinking, sort of the cultural argument, which is a more right-wing sort of argument that seems implicit in there. And I guess I'm just wondering, not to put you on the spot, but kind of like, where do you stand on that kind of debate, or how do you look at those sort of that set of issues?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll answer. So this question comes up often when I talk about this in different types of forums, because people will say the first question that usually comes up as an element is, so you're saying that policies that incentivize basically the redistribution of poverty, that incentivize integration. People will say, well, does that mean that you're giving up on high poverty neighborhoods? So you're basically just trying to pull people out of high poverty neighborhoods, and isn't that a problem for the high poverty neighborhoods? And my answer to that is I think that it's a two-pronged strategy. We have to continue to invest in high poverty neighborhoods, their institutions, their schools, but I think it's the role of the state to also ensure that that access to opportunity is equitable. So it's not saying that we need to be forcing people to move, kind of like what we did with the Boston busing program, which a grad student is going to be talking about in our next colloquium. But the idea is that you ensure access to opportunity, and that if people want to move, or they want their kids to go to a different school. Now then you have the kind of choice model, which is kind of in vogue right now on the right, and that gets at some of the politics of how should the state be involved, how should the market be involved in ensuring opportunity. I'm going to take the kind of cheap answer, and I say that there's a market role and there's a state role to make sure that that opportunity is available and equally distributed. I think that the state is clearly failing in that role, and that's why we're seeing things like choice options, vouchers, choice for schools, charter schools, because the state just isn't doing it. So now we're going to give the market a chance, and we're to see if the market can give a better shot at making sure there's equal access to things like school opportunity. And that's the experiment that America is taking on right now. We're to see how it goes. I think there's probably some kind of middle ground, whether you're talking education or you're talking housing policy.
I have a general question about these three presentations, and that is, I'm not quite sure how to frame it, but it seems to me that underlying many, the empirical circumstances, or even the sort of philosophical questions in many of these narratives, many of these stories, is something about the moral value of place, or how people value place, whether it's the place of the sovereign nation state, whether it's the place of in a city neighborhood or part of the suburb, or whether it's place in a contested colonial situation. Is a lot of what these stories get at is underlying them is some sense of what place gives to people or doesn't give to people. And I wonder if you could sort of dig into that a little bit and talk about some of those issues one by one.
Yeah, like you mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there's no more dramatic group who appreciates what a place is than people who don't have a place of their own, who don't have a territory that they can make a claim to. And what I try to articulate is that this is fundamental for human beings over and above what it gives you concretely, whether it gives you political rights or citizenship or access to the law or something like that. Being without a place that you can call your own, or having no kind of belonging to a place, impacts on what it means to be a human being. So there's something really fundamental about having a meaningful place in the world, as Hannah puts up.
I was going to say, I wrote down, because I like Len's phrasing when he said people are trying to make sense of their movement. And I think that all of us were talking a lot about movement and what it means to have a place, move from that place to another place, whether it be a refugee camp, a new community. And I think that, like Serena says, this idea of feeling belonging to a place. What I'm trying to work through when I'm thinking is so interesting is that human capacity to feel a connection to a place in a lot of ways makes that place what it is. And in all these narratives, I think that the people and the way that they're trying to construct meaning out of these places, in turn, makes these places something that have a lot of meaning. So that's something that's been interesting for me to think about.
Something I valued from having the perspective of a philosopher in the group. You know, I was looking at your listening to your presentation, and the morality is something that I don't think sociologists talk about. You know, it's common for philosophers to use the language of it's ought. You know, we ought to do this. We should do this. Sociologists say, okay, I'm going to describe the world, and then I'm out. You know? That's my job. I'm just going to kind of try to make it clear, and then I'm going to step out of it. And something that strikes me with your research and how it parallels to what's going on in places like New Jersey is with things like low-income housing. Every town in New Jersey has to have low-income housing. It's 560 towns, and they all have a state, it's called an affirmative obligation to provide for the need of low-income housing. And it's a huge fight. I mean, if you want to make money, be a lawyer around this kind of stuff in New Jersey, because there's constant legal fights about, well, what is my obligation as a community? And then you have communities that say, should wealthier communities have a greater obligation to provide, to build low-income housing in the community? Or, oh, but these people work the hardest, and therefore, and that's what they say. They say, I worked hard for my money, therefore I shouldn't have to do that. And then, is it lower income communities? How do you construct a number? What's the number? How many low-income housing units should each town have? And I've thought of that as like a demographic problem or a practical problem, but I haven't thought about it as a moral problem. And it's not necessarily a life and death moral problem in the kind of scale at which you're talking about, but it's a moral problem in which, it's in America, it's about an American story in which mobility is promised to us or assumed, and that's not happening for a lot of people. So morality comes into that, and it just gets me thinking about kind of like looking for that in the circumstances.
I'm not denying that I think that identity is constructed a great deal around place. But I'm wondering, is there any value in trying to pull that apart? That what we might try to do is critique the notion or offer alternatives to the notion that identity is often constituted by place. Because I'm thinking of all the horrible things that have been done in human history in the name of place.
Place is definitely a two-sided sword, two-edged sword. Michael Walser, I mentioned, says that we don't have any, he says we have some obligations, just a few, and we don't have any to immigrants because of the value of place. And he says the reason people want to come to our country is because we have these communities of character that are so wonderful. Too many people coming, it will destroy our place, and therefore we have a right to exclude people. So absolutely, there's a way in which there's a back and forth. I think because of the value of that, it can give rise to both kinds of claims to exclusion as well as claims to belonging.
I think there's something, I think I'd make the argument that there is something unique about place and space over other things in which we kind of construct and attach identity, because all social action has to occur in a place. You can think about other bases of shared identity. That might be something like the work that you perform, or that might be our kind of social characteristics, whether it's gender or age, or politics. And we've done any number of good or bad things based on identifying with those characteristics. But place is special because it's like, we are physical beings. We have to occupy. This is like the crux of your argument. It's just like you've got 72 million people that don't have a place, but that's their one life and they're living it. So the importance of understanding that in terms of identity is just so crucial. We can have, not everyone needs work. Not everyone needs a variety of other things in which we can construct identities or contest identities, but place, you just have to have it.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry. I was gonna say, I think that, the reciprocity is really important. I think certainly attaching a cause, attaching yourself, attaching your identity to a place can be very violent, especially thinking about colonization. I mean, absolutely. But I also think, in thinking about Serena's project too, the way that identities can help construct a place as well, like to decide that we want to change the way a place looks, or the way a place like a refugee camp looks, and what that entails, I think is a really important thing to think about, rather than necessarily thinking that there's a huge problem with identifying with a place, but what if that place needs to identify with us, and we're changing and thinking through things.
Just to add a few comments, there's a very interesting paper by the anthropologist Lisa Nalke from quite a long time ago, where she constructs the idea of a sedentarist metaphysics, or an idea that we are so place-based in our moral thinking that anything or anyone that is out of place is immediately seen as difficult. This is something that she talks about homeless people and refugees in particular as, and she's a studier, I think, of refugees as people that are not only they're displaced in a geographical sense, but this kind of moral sedentarism actually doubles the stigma attached to them. And the other thing that's interesting about place in relation to refugees is there are a number of sort of stories about how in various places around the world, refugees in camps are refusing to make them more like a place, because the more they become like a place, the less chance they'll have of getting what they actually want. And so there's some interesting kind of things going on there. Some of them apparently are becoming more place-like over over 50 years or something. And even then, people are trying to say, no, we can't do that, otherwise we'll never leave you.
That was the logic of how high-rise public housing was developed in the United States. I mean, it was purposefully designed to be too small. There was no closets. The idea that it was supposed to just be it was temporary, and then people end up being stuck there for generations, or having children.
Yeah. Larry?
So my point was going to be exactly on your last point about the refusal to make certain places home, and the political implications of that. But what I notice is that all of you talk about, in one way or another, certainly Emily and Len, conceptualizations of home, and different narrative conceptualizations of home. And you, Emily, in particular, I think Rollins uses home in two ways. It's the place from which she came that was really home, and wherever she is or lives is her home. And I think all of us do that. We talk about home, and often we mean the place from which we came, or some origin, and home as wherever we are. So we have that sort of dual use. And I guess my question really is for you, Serena, because and it's about the relationship between the use of narrative in the story you tell about refugees. I mean, I hear the moral. There's a moral point that's made in the philosophic argument. Is there a place for collecting narratives, refugee narratives of refugee camps, and the narratives of people who had been refugees and made homes elsewhere, to inform what can be done with places where refugees are? That is, and this is where I was, I hadn't formulated in my head the way Tim had, but what I was thinking is there a goal possibly of making these places more like home? And if so, that could be a good thing, but there are all kinds of political reasons why the refugees themselves wouldn't want to do that. So, make them safer, better.
So there's an industry around refugee narratives. So there's a lot of anthropologists who work on that. And it's actually part of what I'm using in this chapter that I mentioned, where I'm using critical refugee literature. So there's an anthropologist named Michel Agier, who also kind of has a philosophical training. And he argues that if you look at refugee narratives and their discourse around home, their past home and their future home, it's always in a way. So one of the sort of parts of the ontological harm is that there's the temporality of the human being is fundamentally in limbo. They're not there. They're always in the past, in their home that they've had to flee, that they've left, that was so glorious and wonderful, and the home of the future, what will be, what's going to happen there, and so on. So it's very interesting. It's a very rich literature in the way people talk, where home gets reframed and the future gets reframed in terms of sort of dislocated, disjointedness in space. So one of the proposals that I think we ought to be advocating much more strongly for is something called temporary local integration. So refugee camps are horrible places, and I don't think they should be sustained. What I do think is that refugees living in countries ought to be allowed to be part of the country that they live in. So it goes to what you're saying, that they ought to be able to have a home. If we acknowledge that it's not going to be 2 years that they're there, it's going to be 15, 20 years, they ought to be allowed to put down roots and have a home, even if it's only temporary, even if only one day that they'll be allowed to return. It could be the case that refugees themselves don't want to do it, but even if they did, they certainly are not allowed to. One of the ways that refugees are dehumanized in refugee camps is precisely because they have no claim to the place. They have no claim to be where they are living. They have no claim to anything. And there are tons of examples of sites within refugee camps being bulldozed, being razed, like very much, you can think about the Palestinian territories. I will, for various reasons, punitive, hygiene, and the UNHCR, whatever agency is overseeing the camp, or the host state has the right to do this as well. So you can't, without any sense of permanency, without any ability to claim a space, I think it's impossible to have a home. So I think one of the things we ought to be thinking about is ways in which people who are temporarily dislocated in time can still have a place. So I think that's exactly what we need to be thinking more creatively about. It's not going to be, in Boston. It's not going to be back home. It's somehow it has to be over there, because human beings can't live without that.
Does anyone have a question you want to ask? Otherwise, Kathleen will.
One of the things I was thinking is from an eco-critical position about anthropogenic change, and you talked about environmental degradation. And I'm thinking about, in all of your cases, I'm thinking about gardens, okay? Thinking about Native Americans planting, moving on, this dangerous season. And in the refugee camp, how growing food or just ornamentals creates home. And then in subsidized housing, the restrictions on the outside space, so that they cannot grow gardens, that maintenance is coming in, mowing the lawn, and how that connection with the land to grow things, to make things, creates home. And I'm wondering if you've come across any stories about that in both of your projects.
I'm trying to think. I mean, there's definitely not a lot of discussion about that. I think it is a way that some long-term refugees are able to supplement so they're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to have any kind of self-sufficiency independent of what they're provided. But I think in some cases they are allowed to farm certain things. But it's terrible. It's not going to be good land. They're not going to have any access to resources. I've never heard anything ornamental. I'll keep an eye out for that more, but I've not read anything about that.
All you need is a pot.
Yeah,
and some dirt. You may not be able to grow, rows of corn, but.
In the with the case of Ethel Lawrence, the developer and the architects, they were very concerned about reducing stigma in Mount Laurel. So they were concerned about the idea that someone might see Ethel Lawrence and say that is low-income housing, and then stigmatize it, and then people would stigmatize the residents. So they put huge amounts of money in the landscaping, with the idea that it would mimic the landscaping of the surrounding subdivisions, which is a particular kind of environment. It's a constructed environment with the green grass and the sort of kind of hedgerows and everything. And I mean, they literally were trying to precisely replicate what the landscaping looked like. In ways that have proved problematic to residents that want to use the outside space in different ways with things like gardens. So Ms. Mary wants to have a garden, the older woman who sits on her porch. And she's not allowed to have one in her backyard. So what she has is 3 small plants on basically like a stand-up thing, and she loves that, and that's hers. And but if she could, she would have that garden space. So there's a tension there, and I think it's up to our kind of architects and designers to come up with interventions that can allow for what people are seeking, but also still try to do that stigma reduction ideally, because that stigma is real and it is operative.
Is any gardening and Catholic
I
narrative?
actually,
Not time really.
yeah, I don't know.
Cooking.
I have to think about it.
Sewing,
I
right?
mean, obviously
You-
the land is incredibly important, and the way that people connect to land is incredibly important, and, you know, going back to Lori's point, like, home and space is always in relation to the subject, in relation to the eye. Who's speaking about it, so I'd have to go back and think about how that functions in captivity narratives. Especially because they're all during war times, there's movement so fast. So much, I don't know, think about it.
I think I'd like to call this to a halt and thank Len and Serena and Emily a lot for their presentations. And thank all of you for coming during marking or exams or whatever it is you're doing close to the seasonal break. And there is more of you got to fly us over on your chairs with the other two events in which you missed. So we will see you back there. Thank you.
Like for future